I told you that my sort of trajectory is an activist who likes to interact with the academic world, but I'm clearly an activist more than an academic. David was a longtime activist, active in, he was actually in the Army during the Vietnam War, and as a foot soldier decided we needed a better approach. He became the director of SANE, which was one of the leading anti-war groups and anti-nuclear weapons movement, nuclear freeze campaign of the 80s. He'll, in 2002, helped found Win Without War, a coalition of organizations against the invasion of Iraq. But then he became an academic, and he balances both very nicely, I think. He teaches now peace studies and nonviolent social change at the University of Notre Dame, which, as you might have heard, is a Catholic school that has a rivalry with Georgetown. Not really, of course. They're very collegial and cooperative. And Director of Policy Studies at the Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. He researches and writes about peace and security, about Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, the abolition of nuclear weapons, counterterrorism, sanctions, and a lot of ideas in the peace movement. David, thank you for coming, and we welcome you. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, and it's wonderful to be here at our rival but friendly university here at Georgetown. So I want to say, first of all, a few words about myself and then talk about some of the broader principles of counterterrorism, how we can address the real threats that exist in the world from groups like Al-Qaeda, but to do so in the framework of principles of nonviolence. But first, a word about myself, and David, maybe you can put up that first slide. Jim mentioned that I was in the U.S. Army, and yeah, my students often ask, well, how did you become a professor of peace studies? It's almost like asking, well, why don't you get a real job? But for me, it started very ironically. I was drafted in 1968 to be part of the U.S. Army. I had graduated from Notre Dame as an undergrad, and very conservative Catholic kid. I really didn't think about politics, but there's nothing like being drafted to fight a war to focus your attention. So is it? Yeah. Yeah. There's a saying that says, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And that's true for many people around the world. It was certainly true for me in 1968. So I went into the Army, and the more I was in, the more I began to have doubts. And so I became part of the GI peace movement. It's hard to believe, but there were many active duty service members, like myself, who came in. We were either drafted, or in my case, I was a draft-induced volunteer. But we were there, and we learned what was really going on the ground in Vietnam, and increasingly felt that we had to speak out. So this was a poster, and maybe you can recognize that signature there on the bottom left. That's Richard Avedon, the great photographer. I was called one day from one of the anti-war committees. They said, would you like to pose for an anti-war poster? I said, sure, whatever I can do to try to end the war. Well, go downtown to the studio of this guy named Richard Avedon. I was kind of naive and not very informed in those days. I had no idea who he was. And yes, that is a real dove. He had me holding a dove. And, so this poster became quite famous during the anti-war movement. There was a kind of a Peter Max psychedelic version of it that was produced. But this is a photo not about me, but about a movement. This was a personification of a movement of active duty service members. There were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of us who spoke out. There was an organization called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Maybe you've heard the name of one of our leaders in those days, John Kerry, Senator John Kerry. And that's what set me on a path for working to prevent war, to try to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. And I've really never looked back and have remained committed on this path all during these years. And increasingly, as we've looked at these questions, for me at least, it's the necessity of committing to the fundamental values of nonviolence. the principles that Gandhi pioneered, that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. applied here in the U.S., and that are increasingly being applied in struggles all over the world for social justice. Certainly in South Africa, Nelson Mandela's movement in the last years was using the classic methods of nonviolent resistance. But many have asked in this age of terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and nuclear proliferation, whether these principles of nonviolence have any meaning. Gandhi's theory is nice, but it has no relevance to our time. What can Gandhi say to bin Laden, for example? Well, I think actually Gandhi had a lot to say, and I want to kind of talk through some of these basic principles about how to address counterterrorism per se, and maybe about the Afghanistan context in particular. There we go. So let's first of all recognize that terrorist groups are a real threat. We know that. And we all want to see effective policies that can actually bring an end to murderous criminal groups like Al-Qaeda. The RAND Corporation did a study a couple years ago. How many of you have heard about the RAND Corporation? So you know it's a Pentagon think tank. It's not a bunch of peaceniks. It's been in existence since the late 1940s, and it is a principal agency that does research for the U.S. Department of Defense. And they studied a few years ago what do we know about the policies that bring terrorist groups to an end. And this graph shows it very well. Two principal ways in which terrorist groups end. One is through political bargaining. An agreement is worked out. The terrorists are political groups. They have purposes, and through bargaining, it's often possible to bring those groups to an end and work out an accommodation. The other principal means is policing. Good old-fashioned law enforcement. Good intelligence about what's going on in the communities. Who are the, quote, bad guys? Who are the people who are out plotting to murder innocent civilians or assassinate political leaders? Police work is primarily the main means, along with political coalition building. Sometimes terrorist groups do succeed, and once in a while, but very rarely, military force is a means of bringing these groups to an end. So we can see that the ways in which we go about countering these murderous groups are not fundamentally military, but are related to things we know very well, political deals and policing. So let's a couple of examples. So one of the most well-known political bargains is the Good Friday Accords, negotiated between British government and the IRA, with the Irish Republic participating. Bill Clinton was one of his major achievements in foreign policy, working with Tony Blair and others to bring together this negotiation. And so the troubles that had so afflicted Northern Ireland and even England itself for more than 2 decades, and a war that had gone on, well, actually since the first Irish War, in the Irish Republic War, but even back centuries, finally came to more or less an end with this agreement. Political power sharing, various arrangements, very complicated, but it shows that bargaining does work. Political negotiations have brought many conflicts to an end, and that's just one example. And then policing. As we sit here, there are around the world literally thousands of law enforcement officers, intelligence officials, working to counter terrorist plots. And there are many of them, and Al-Qaeda is a broad international threat. One of the most prominent, one of the most horrifying, if it had occurred, was in 2006. Maybe you heard about it when there was a plot to simultaneously bring down 10 airliners leaving from Heathrow to the U.S. I actually had a chance to talk to the deputy superintendent of the London police who was involved in this investigation. And I asked him, well, how did this work out? It was basic law enforcement. It was police officers walking up and down the streets of the neighborhoods where there's a lot of South Asian and Pakistani communities where this plot was being hatched, who were able to talk to people in the streets who would say, well, you ought to check out that house down the street. There are some strange things going on, and you ought to watch what's happening here. Good community relations between the police and the neighbors, working with the communities, and then good intelligence, cooperation between the Pakistani, U.S., German, and British intelligence and police succeeded in identifying these plotters, arresting them before anything happened. And there have been literally hundreds of terrorist plots that have been interdicted around the world through this kind of law enforcement. I've had a chance to go to quite a number of these international counterterrorism conferences. Police, law enforcement officials are watching every day and working to try to prevent these kind of plots. These are the things that work. There's no mention here of war on terror, of bombings, of invasions, and military occupations. Those policies, unfortunately, tend to create the opposite effect. They tend to generate insurgencies. They tend to prompt extremist political behavior and suicide bombings. There's a new book, I don't have a slide on it since it just came out, but at the University of Chicago, their political science department is known as a center of political realism. They're not peaceniks over there. They believe very much in the realpolitik approach to international politics. And one of their leading scholars, Robert Pape, P-A-P-E, has just published a new book based on an earlier one in which he has assembled a database of more than 2,000 suicide bombings that have occurred since the 1980s. And of course, the numbers have skyrocketed since our invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. And his data shows overwhelmingly that the principal motivation for suicide bombers, the political causation that can be identified, or called at least the association that can be identified, is military occupation. Extremist movements, suicide terrorists, groups like the Taliban today, their primary purpose is to drive out those forces that are seen as foreign invaders. They're trying to liberate, as they see it, their home territory. So our policies of military invasion and occupation are unfortunately making the terrorist problem worse. This slide shows the international counterterrorism strategy that has been developed through the United Nations. We were involved in advising a number of the UN member states and the agencies that helped to develop this strategy. This was passed unanimously by the UN General Assembly in September of 2006, and it is now the operative strategy. And here again, there's no indication of invasion and occupation, but rather a serious attempt to understand what are the factors that bring about these kind of extremist movements and how do we address them. So addressing conditions conducive is the first pillar. There used to be a phrase which said, well, let's look at the root causes. But that language is kind of offensive because it almost suggests that the actions are somehow justified. So this concept of conditions that are conducive tries to help us look at it in a more objective manner. And conditions conducive can mean a lot of things. One of the principal ones is political grievances that have not been addressed, where there are no legitimate civilian political procedures by which aggrieved communities can have their concerns addressed, their grievances ameliorated. And certainly military occupation is one of those. But it also includes factors of social and economic development and denial of human rights. Poverty is a factor. Now, we know that poverty does not cause terrorism. It's not that simple. On the other hand, we know that the lack of economic development, the lack of economic opportunities of jobs and education for especially young men in many communities does increase the probability of armed conflict and terrorism. The studies of Paul Collier and the group at Oxford University that have been working on development policy for many years have shown this quite convincingly through a number of empirical studies, quantitative analyses. So providing economic opportunities, proper education, and dealing with political grievances, providing mechanisms by which aggrieved communities can bring their concerns to the political authorities. In this country, we're blessed. We don't like a lot of things that are going on, but we have channels by which we can activate ourselves in communities and mobilize. A lot of countries around the world, you can't do that. You're likely to be shot down in the streets. And in those conditions, people will take up the gun, they'll start playing the bombs and going for assassination. Pillar 2 is prevent and control. Here's where we talk about law enforcement. And in my own view, yes, sometimes security operations are necessary. If you can identify a terrorist group and you come to apprehend them and they shoot back, well, the police or security officials may need to shoot and use some force. But always targeted, very focused on apprehending and trying to bring to justice those who have been identified, hopefully through some kind of a legal procedure with a writ of court, some kind of a judgment that's from a legal authority, to bring to justice those who have been identified as responsible for these murderous acts. The third is to build state capacity and UN capacity to understand that terrorism that exists today, the global terrorism, the terrorism of Al-Qaeda, is a global phenomenon, and it often has a global agenda. Al-Qaeda has this grandiose millennial notion of bringing back the caliphate and undermining many governments in the Arab world. So it requires a global response. And it requires governments in the regions where terrorism is most a problem to have greater capacity for law enforcement, yes, but also for human rights and for democratic outlets. Countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and others, where there's little or no opportunity for political mobilization to address concerns, that's a problem. And then the fourth pillar, human rights and the rule of law, it really undergirds the whole strategy and says that in order to overcome this act of extreme violence, it's necessary to uphold and respect human rights and law. Terrorism is the exact opposite of human rights. It is the use of violent force versus human rights, which says everyone should have the right to social development and to political freedom. So we need to respect that. I mean, there's too much thinking, in my view, that we have to sacrifice human rights. You know, Dick Cheney famously said, and Jane Mayer wrote this book, the dark side. We have to go over to the dark side in order to go after murderers like Al-Qaeda. Au contraire, we need to be more vigilant and more vigorous in our support of human rights and the rule of law, because that is the strongest defense we have against groups like Al-Qaeda. This slide kind of, rather simply, but maybe you get the idea, tries to outline a concept of differentiating between the hardcore murderers who perpetrate these acts, bin Laden and his lieutenants and the core Al-Qaeda militants, and the surrounding communities that provide sympathy or at least acquiescence to these activities. And too much of our policy in the U.S. confuses this. But we have to recognize that a lot of these communities, people kind of support the Taliban agenda. Taliban says our main goal is to get rid of the foreign forces. Most people in Afghanistan agree with that, as they did in Iraq. They want the foreign invaders out. And so people will look the other way when there's somebody out there at night digging a hole and putting a bomb in the road that's going to blow up and kill some American troops. You know, in your neighborhoods, think about it. If somebody was out there planting a bomb, you know, everybody in the neighborhood would be out. They'd do a citizen arrest. They'd certainly call the cops. You know, it wouldn't happen. But in these communities, it happens because people are either sympathetic or they allow it to happen. And so we need to organize the political arrangements in such a way that the surrounding communities are working against the terrorists. And they're working for a legitimate and representative government that exists in those communities, we hope. And here again, in Afghanistan, we don't have that. I mean, the Kabul government is thoroughly corrupt, completely unreliable, has very little authority over most of the country. So what choices do people have? There's no legitimate, functioning, democratic government that will listen to them. And so the Taliban comes along, offers to organize society differently and to resist the foreigners, and unfortunately, a lot of people sympathize. So the strategies, the general principles of the strategies have to be oriented towards mobilizing communities of sympathizers to separate from the extreme militants. And there's a range of activities that can be done that are non-military. security operations is maybe quasi-military. It's more law enforcement, as I mentioned. It's policing. So I'm not an absolute pacifist. I'm not offering a position here that says military force, some use of force is never appropriate. Sometimes it may be necessary. But always within the context of a rule of law, and as I said earlier, ideally within the framework of even a judicial ruling. Police and intelligence cooperation. There's a great deal of work in this area now underway. One of the groups that I work with is the Center on Global Counterterrorism Cooperation. Go to globalct.org. Or is it com? Might be com. But Global CT. And look at their website. It's mind-blowing. They're working with groups all over the world to get police and human rights officials and justice officials working together against Al-Qaeda. And it shows that things can really be done. And what I mentioned earlier about the success in interdicting these plots is partly due to this kind of work. Financial controls. A lot of the financing of terrorism can be controlled through better financial regulation. Some of the things I mentioned earlier in terms of governance, human rights, development, and especially the addressing of fundamental political grievances through conflict mediation, conflict transformation. There are fundamental principles of peace building that we teach in our peace studies program at the Kroc Institute in Notre Dame, and that are taught here at Georgetown and many other places around the world. We know now a lot about what causes violent conflict and what can be done to create more prospects for peaceful development. So, mutual democracy, support for international institutions and the rule of law, greater trade opportunities that are fair and equitable. The empowerment of women is critically important. We have more and more data now showing that in societies where women have economic opportunity, where they have educational opportunity, and are sitting at the tables of power in equal numbers, those societies are much less likely to be oriented towards the use of military force. Sustainable development, as I mentioned earlier, and conflict resolution and peacemaking diplomacy. These are fundamental principles of peacemaking, of peace building. They apply to civil conflict, to interstate war, and they apply to the phenomenon of violent extremism as in terms of terrorism. Fundamentally, it comes to a principle that we all understand. We recognize the famous saying from Paul VI, but something that is not embedded and not really integrated into our national policy. To address these violent conflicts, to overcome the scourge of war and the scourge of terrorism, we must work for justice. It doesn't mean in any way excusing these murderous acts. In fact, we need to be as vigorous as possible through the kinds of measures that I mentioned to identify, arrest, and eliminate those kinds of threats. But we also have to work as vigorously and more so for justice to address those conditions conducive, as the United Nations describes it.
From a more domestic spending policy perspective, are the Departments of Defense and State investing in the right types of resources, and do they have the necessary organizational structures to address these conflicts?
Unfortunately not, I don't think. The Defense Department, the Secretary of Defense Gates has made some wonderful speeches about the way in which in the modern era security is not gained through military force alone, and we have to have more civilian capacity. We need to send more development specialists, more election monitors, more human rights specialists to these countries, which I completely agree with. But I don't see it. The president has sent 50,000 more troops since he's been in office, and the last count I heard there's maybe 600 or 700 additional civilians from the State Department. So the priorities are all wrong, and we are providing a lot of development aid, or what we call development aid. But the biggest portion of it is going through the Pentagon. In Afghanistan, as in Iraq, they have these so-called PRTs, Provincial Reconstruction Teams, completely run by the military, and they're funding good things, building schools, building wells and things, and it's all fine, but it's being done through the military. And so a lot of those activities then become suspect in the communities. Some of them get blown up. Some of the civilians who work in them become threatened by the Taliban and the insurgents. So, I mean, some of the ideas are right. I think the intentions are right, but the tools are wrong. We should be doing this through civilian means. And even the State Department, I would argue, has a limited capacity. I mean, there are lots of civilian non-governmental groups, civil society movements in Afghanistan, as there are in Iraq and all countries around the world. We ought to be identifying the groups that we think have good values that are compatible with ours and supporting them and helping them to improve human rights, to improve social development. They know what they need better than we do. But our aid policies have been shifting away from the civil society NGOs, and as I say, part of it, a big chunk of it is going through the Pentagon.
In fact, those numbers, the Presidential Council on Faith-Based thing that I was part of, Rich Stearns chaired the Global Poverty Task Force there. And our recommendations to the President included from that task force, pointing out that it used to be 40% to 50% of U.S. foreign aid dollars went through independent, non-government organizations like World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, and so on. And that shifted now to only 10%, 40% to 10%. So our recommendations were that's the wrong balance, because now a third of our tax dollars for foreign aid go to the Pentagon, a third more are corporate, Blackwater. So a third corporate, a third military, and only 10% now, when it was 40% for years and years and years. Big shift. Bush started that shift, but Obama hasn't changed it. Other questions? Yes.
Do you think that development that really treats the social and economic problems that prevent terrorism in Afghanistan can happen without heavy American involvement?
Well, I think it will have to. I mean, I think the problem is that as long as we are there, especially now after 9 years, we've created a signature, which is military occupation, and caused thousands of deaths. And for us to change direction, we need to change direction, but I don't see how we can sort of change our stripes and be seen as something different. But I agree with your basic premise. There needs to be a major commitment to socio-economic development. But it can't be done through the U.S. military. I think we should be there. Americans should be there, and American dollars should be there. But predominantly and gradually, completely civilian. I was telling Jim at lunch, we've done some research on, what programs are working. I mean, it's not all doom and gloom, and especially in terms of trying to protect the rights of women in Afghanistan. And there are some very positive achievements. For example, in education, and I'll just offer a little bit of data here. In 2001, there were 900,000 boys going to school, no girls. Today, there's 7.3 million boys and girls. 37% are girls. On healthcare, life expectancy in Afghanistan is about the worst in the world. Maternal mortality rates are the worst in the world. It's just horrendous. But there are slight improvements now. Midwives were looked down upon by the Taliban. Now there's thousands of trained midwives who've gone through schooling and are available to help mothers, newborns, in that critical period of birth and early infancy. And so we're starting to see now the infant mortality and maternal mortality rates are going down. And there are other things I could go into. These are all positive improvements. But these programs have come entirely through civilian funding from the World Bank, European Union, USAID has been involved very much, the United Nations, and various other donor states. Hundreds of millions of dollars a year are being spent on these programs. And most of them are succeeding. Schools, some schools are being bombed and acid being thrown at the girls and the teachers. But other schools, most schools are continuing and prospering. And it looks like the primary factor that accounts for the difference is the schools in which the communities are engaged. The communities help to build them. Greg Mortenson's program. Greg Mortenson doesn't come in and build schools for people. He helps bring the materials, but the communities have to build the schools and they have to help organize it, and it has to be their school. Under those conditions, the schools seem to survive. And the Taliban has to depend on community support. They can't operate without community support against foreign forces or against their own armed forces in Afghanistan. So if the community wants the school, they have to go with it, even though they may have a very different view on education. The programs need to be there, but and we need to continue to support it. Those dollars need to come at large numbers, and our civilian people should be there to help. But as long as it's associated with the big military presence, it's not going to be successful.
David, to offer just a devil's advocate, some would say, and do say, as the first guest lecturer in this class, Mike has said since he was here in the Washington Post, he'd be all for these. He'd be all for what you're for, but until we achieve a certain level of military victory or success, we can't create the conditions under which the development can occur. So we have to first have enough military success to make all of this work. Mike Curson would